All right, welcome back to College Football Addiction. A little breaking news. We don't do a lot of breaking news here. We kind of just react to stuff, but I guess we'll react to this a little bit. Dan Thompson, you can follow him on Twitter, DK Thompson, I guess X if you call it that now. And you can watch him over at Stadium and Gale on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Dan, a little bit of breaking news with Billy Napier. Sounds like not just the vote of confidence, like a message from Scott Strickland, Florida's athletic director, that he will be back next season. We'll dive into this a little bit, but just immediate reaction. Like this literally came across 23 minutes ago. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah. I think there's multiple sides here. I think number one is there's not really a large swath of available candidates that are on the market. And certainly Florida has been paying off coaches for the better part of the last decade in terms of buyouts and spending a lot of money in doing so. And firing Billy Napier would have set back the University of Florida another $26 million, half of that up front, and then the rest over the next 3 years after that. So I think there's a little bit of a financial decision. Certainly you can say that the team is looked formidable. Certainly they're 4-4 right now. They were tied with Georgia with just a few minutes left in that game with their third string walk-on quarterback, which is probably another problem that we'll talk about why is Florida's third string quarterback a walk-on. But Billy Napier's 15-18. He's 8-13 in the SEC, and I don't see that record getting much better on either side. They still have Texas, Ole Miss, LSU left to go before finishing the season with Florida State. So this would be Billy Napier's and will likely be Billy Napier's third straight consecutive season under 500 and the Gators' fourth consecutive season under 500. So I think that they were circling the wagons after the Miami game and certainly after the Texas A&M game. You can say that the team looks marginally better, and now you lose DJ Lagway for at least the next few weeks, if not for the rest of the season. And is that enough hope to sell the Gator fan base? I guess we'll see, but you also couldn't live in a limbo stage, and I think that that's why Scott Strickland came out just a few minutes ago to say that he would be back.
What is your, I know you kind of cover the team in what you do, but there's some, you are a big Gator fan. You want them to, what is your fan reaction to this? And certainly the fan base is not thrilled. I don't know how many happy commenters we're going to get here, but what are you, I don't know. It just seems wild. I'm all jokes aside, but it seems wild to have 3 straight losing seasons. And I get it. He's unlucky. 3 straight starting quarterback injuries over the last 12 months
games.
is insane and unlucky. But even with maybe they would have snuck out the Georgia game and that would have been a big deal. But maybe not. Maybe they still will, and so it just seems wild to have 3 straight losing seasons. And
yeah, and I think that that's the big thing, right, is recruiting got marginally better, and certainly you can look at the talent on the team and say that this team looks more formidable over the last, this season when he starts to get his guys in. But we're talking year 3 with the transfer portal, and it just, my gut reaction as a Gator fan is that Billy Napier has been given more opportunity, more money, and more resources than any coach at the University of Florida. The University of Florida was one of the first, if not the first school to create an NIL collective. In fact, the phrase comes from what Florida started from a collective perspective. So I think looking at the University of Florida and Billy Napier's tenure over the last 3 years is it's not just in talent acquisition. It's not just that Florida has less talent than anybody. It's the same coaching issues that have existed in year 1 still exist in year 3. There's still a ton of special teams penalties. The defense is finally starting to look a little bit better, but you still have kind of the same bland vanilla offense. You can look at Florida and say that there's been some improvements in some areas, but to be a coach making $7.5 million with probably a staff that's 2 or 3 times larger than Dan Mullen's staff and probably 4 or 5 times bigger than what Will Muschamp or Jim McElwain had, in terms of all of the resources that you had, there's still issues with organization and still issues with on-the-field play. And when they hired Billy Napier, they said that this is what we're trying to solve is our organizational issues, our coaching issues, our communication issues. And all of those problems still exist in year 3. And that, to me, as a fan, if you're not getting better in year 3, at what point should we expect improvement? what point should we expect improvement in NIL, right? A lot of fans complain about that. Well, what is an extra year going to do? You now have an under 500 record, a well under 500 record in the SEC. Are all of a sudden you're going to say Billy Napier's coming back, and Florida fans are going to be like, all right, cool. Like, here's my hardworking money to now support this coach that, like, you're probably kicking the can downhill. And what happens next year? Are you then competing with Florida State, Auburn, USC, a number of other larger schools to try to find a head coach? I don't know, TJ. I just don't know what they're trying to solve here.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that like pop in your mind and you think like why, right? And so obviously the Scott Strickland, if there was a president, would Scott Strickland still have a job? Kind of thoughts like run through your head, like was he not able or willing or whatever to make that hire, kind of needing Napier to work out for his own security? I mean, think about the Lagway effect. Like, is there enough hope in Lagway at just being the guy, like coming out next year and taking everything by storm? So there's a lot of like reasons why. I also think about the 2025 schedule is essentially the same. Now you lose UCF off of it, but like Miami may not be as good. You'd think that Florida State will not be as bad. We'll see, but
here's to hoping.
Wouldn't expect them to have 2 wins going in the last game of the year next year. So like maybe Florida State's a bit better. Maybe Miami's not as good, but the SEC opponents are still the same. And so, I'm asking you 6 things at once. My take is actually that Billy Napier probably would have more success next year than any other first-year coach coming in. Maybe not with the portal if you could like really hit on a quarterback, but Napier probably would be more likely to have success in 25 than anyone else. But like, is 6 and 6 or 7 and 5? Like, does 7 and 5 work for UF next year? I mean, I don't know. Obviously, that'd be market improvement over the first 3 years, but just I don't know. I think about why, and it's just like, well, no, all of those whys are kind of superficial. Like, it's not guaranteed that any of that kind of works out for next year.
Yeah, and certainly you can look at the roster and say that these are guys that Billy Napier recruited, and maybe you don't get the same flood of players to the transfer portal. And maybe that's a good thing, but maybe the team is still 4-4, right? It's like we don't want to lose all of this talent. It's like all of that talent is still 4-4. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those players aren't going to necessarily leave or see an opportunity. Nobody expected Trevor Etienne to enter the transfer portal after last season, and he did. So does a guy like Eugene Wilson, who's not been as featured in the offense, and certainly he's injured and out for the season now with a genetic hip injury, but he wasn't very well featured in the DJ Lagway offense. So does he potentially look to go out? And so all of a sudden you start to look at these individual case-by-case basis of some of these players might have an opportunity to put themselves in a position to win a championship, because Florida is not in a position to compete for an SEC or a national championship next season. So again, you look at the last 3 years in a vacuum and it says, does Billy Napier seem to be the coach that can take you to that next level that the University of Florida fan base and hopefully the athletic department to be? We've called Billy Napier and Scott Strickland the 2 luckiest guys in college sports right now, because Ben Sass did resign as University of Florida president before the season started. I've heard from very well-placed sources that would absolutely know if he was still the University of Florida president, neither one of them would be employed by the University of Florida right now. So again, Florida puts themselves in this purgatory situation where you start to think of moral victories and you're like, well, maybe it's not that bad, or it could be worse next year with a better or with a different coach, it could be better next year, keeping the players and hopefully Billy Napier's learned his lessons. But again, the same issues exist. Is your offensive line looks a little bit better this year, but they're recruiting terribly. They are ranked in the 50s right now, and I think that they have one offensive line commit out of that group. You don't have a quarterback for the class of 2025 committed. The guy for the class of 2026, nobody really in the big 3 or the major schools that you would compete against wanted him either. And so Graham Mertz, you got in the transfer portal. He's graduated. You're getting DJ Lagway. What does your quarterback situation look like next season? Are you going to be able to go and attract a quality backup? Clay Millen transferred to the University of Florida from Colorado State. He got beat out by a walk-on from Yale that's now going to be starting for at least the next few games at the University of Florida. So when you look at that, there's some roster management issues. You're going to be losing some folks on the defensive side of the ball. How well can they go to the transfer portal to recruit, knowing that maybe they can get some senior players or some guys that are on their final year, but is anybody going to hedge their bets that Billy Napier is going to be there the year after that, right? Because now we know if you have to put out a statement of confidence going into next season, that you're immediately on the hot seat next season because you had to issue the one for this season, right? So I don't know how keeping Billy Napier solves any problems of today. I also don't know how they fix any problems of the future either, because Florida's still not recruiting well. And I just don't know where Florida can find themselves in a different position next season, after next season, than they find themselves after this season for the Florida fan base.
Yeah, you mentioned the portal and recruiting, and yeah, they're not recruiting super well right now. I'd imagine they finish with a, I don't know, they're in the 50s now. I'd imagine they finish, at least around like somewhere in the 20s. Would once they kind of take some guys late. And you mentioned the portal, like they're going to have to go pretty all in on the portal. Well, that as we have seen, that can be pretty boom or bust in this state.
Yeah.
And like you said, how well do they attract? And, I think, you look at their rivals, like Florida State did really well in the portal before anybody else was using it. There's a much bigger supply and demand issue now, right? And if you're in the portal, are you going to those 6-6 teams? Are you going to those 5-7 teams anymore? Are you going to the, if you're the elite talent, you're going to Ole Miss, right? You're going where you
going to Ohio State.
You think they have a chance to go and compete. Oregon and in the big time programs. That's not to say that you can't find hidden gems or anything else anywhere else, but yeah, it's really hard for me to see Florida, maybe being like an 8-win team next year. Like I could buy that. Like if you really sold me on everybody gets a little bit better, they hit in the portal, but then it seems like, if you're keeping him for Lagway, right? Like, which I don't necessarily know that a decision is being made just for DJ Lagway, but you're basically going all in on 2026 if that's the reason you're doing it. Like get to 7-8 wins next year, and then you try and get to 10 and the playoff in 26. And that just seems, that, I guess could there be enough pushback from this to where you got the vote of confidence now, but like it gets really bad over these last 3-4 weeks? Like you go lose to a 1-win Florida State team. Like, could they change their minds? Like, could they be done?
Could. I think that the reason that they issued it now is because you have such a limited window in which you can fire a coach and get them to National Signing Day, and considering how many players now sign early, and the transfer portal windows have changed as well in terms of duration. So you have to make a decision a little bit earlier than you had to even going back a few years ago. So I think that that's why you had to do it now. But TJ, I think everything you said is right. I mean, what is Florida's ceiling for next season? Sure, they could go. DJ Lagway could be everything that you want to see out of him, but again, you've only seen DJ Lagway play a couple of full games, and while he looked great passing the ball in some of those games, he was also 2-6 against Georgia. The game against Kentucky, he completed 50% of his passes. Sure, he averaged about 40 yards a catch in that game, but there's still some question marks about DJ Lagway. There's still going to be question marks about your offensive line. There's still going to be questions about your defensive line, and how well are you growing and developing the talent that you have. I'm not remiss to say that Florida doesn't find themselves from a top to bottom talent perspective probably better than they've been during Billy Napier's last 3 years. But again, your team is 4-4. You got blown out by Miami at home, where you looked completely unprepared for that game. You lost to Texas A&M, who was playing a quarterback who was starting his first ever game. You made some bad decisions against Tennessee that lost you that game. And then, some unfortunate luck against Georgia cost you that game as well. Going into next season, like you mentioned, you're still playing very, very talented programs. The schedule's not getting any easier. And I don't know what is going to change at the University of Florida, or is his hand going to be forced to make some changes, to make some improvements in NIL and talent identification and talent development that they seem to struggle with right now. I just don't know if I trust this coaching staff and this administration to lead that endeavor. And if Florida is saying we really want to keep Billy Napier so we can go 7-5 next year, we've lost the signal through the noise.
I wonder. I can't imagine the fan base certainly not thrilled. And you think about like the support that he will need to be able to go all in, whether it's in the portal or recruiting or whatever. I don't want to belittle, the everyday folks like me or you that like give to NIL, but the outrage there probably doesn't move the needle a ton. You could have 1,000 $10 a month people cancel, and it really doesn't matter that much. But what about the big time support? Like I'm assuming this happened 20 minutes ago. You haven't made a bunch of phone calls to the people whose names are on buildings. But what about the big time level support? Like, do you think Florida can sell them on like, hey, I know you guys all wanted to change, or a lot of you wanted to change. Like, we're going to stick with the same guy, but we still need you to cash those checks so that we can see if this guy will work out the fourth time.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of frustration among some very big time boosters at the University of Florida about how Florida looked against Miami and against Texas A&M. Could that sentiment have slightly changed because the team is playing hard for Billy Napier? Maybe, but again, I don't always know what goes through the minds of some of these boosters and donors. I know that there's donor fatigue right now. I think for a lot of boosters, right? You think of the macro effects of the economy and what the last couple of years have meant for a lot of different people. And if you're a mega donor to the University of Florida, you're getting hit up by a lot of different people asking for your money and your hard-earned money. And is there an ROI on that, right? Florida has built a new indoor practice facility. They have built a new football-only facility. They've done some renovations they're planning on doing some renovations to Ben Hill Griffin Stadium, and now they're being asked basically in perpetuity to write blank checks for NIL. And I know that there's a lot of frustration by people that have been longtime donors, and Florida's really been in purgatory, maybe other than a couple of seasons where they performed quite well for the last decade and a couple of years. So at some point, donors are going to want to see results, and they're going to want to see the results of the money that they're giving. And right now, there is massive donor fatigue. And I know that there's a very large donor that very few people know about because he doesn't have his names on the buildings or anywhere else, but down in Ocala that has decided that he's not going to donate until there is a change. So I think that there is a lot of fatigue. I don't know what goes into all of the decisions about deciding whether to keep Billy Napier or not. And maybe the decision was they didn't have an option, right? You can talk to agents, you can talk to a lot of different, folks that are in the business to say, hey, these are some people that we could target. Is there the possibility that that person would come to the University of Florida? And maybe the answer is no, or it's going to cost X amount of dollars. And if the way Florida's been spending money in their athletic department over the last few years, maybe it was just an untenable result to say, hey, our hand got forced and we're going to keep Billy Napier, but they had to make a decision because recruiting is terrible. And there's just this aura around Florida's football program of how much longer is Billy Napier going to be here, and is he going to be the coach moving into next year? So you had to make a decision one way or another. And at 11:20 on a Thursday before Texas, where you're 22-point underdogs, is a odd time, but at some point they had to make that decision.
It feels to me like they're punting this decision to next year. Like obviously I cannot see the future. If I could, I'd have a lot more money. It feels like this is now, he could turn it around. He could certainly get them better. It feels like they'll just end up doing what everybody wanted next year. I won't say it's exactly like Orgeron, but that's kind of what it feels like to me. Florida will probably struggle again next year, and they'll end up doing this in 2025. I don't know.
And that's the thing. And, again, you look at potential names for head coaches, right? And I was known on Twitter for always updating my list of who was on my coaching list and everything else. And
you didn't have Napier on there, did you?
Yeah, Billy Napier. No, but now he is the list, right? We had to retire the list until probably this time next year. But James Franklin, he's 7-1. His team's going to be in the playoff this year at Penn State, and Lane Kiffin comes with his question marks about who he is, and certainly Kirk Cignetti is a name that a lot of Gator fans started to get some interest in because Indiana's undefeated. But outside of that, TJ, there's not a lot of like up and coming coaches, or who is that next person, or who's that person that you think can turn it around. And I think Florida's choosing the safe option of saying, hey, we're probably not going to lose a lot of guys to the transfer portal. Maybe we get DJ Lagway, or we'll likely get DJ Lagway back next year, and we try to run it back with the talent that we have. But I don't think that the way that Billy Napier coaches, the staff makeup that they have, and the roster that they have right now, I just don't see a massive improvement next year that really gets the fan base excited again. And certainly I hope I'm wrong. I don't see it.
Yeah, the path to it just seems unlikely, but we could both be wrong, and maybe Scott Strickland is the smartest person in the room on this.
I don't think so, and I also think that for Scott Strickland, when Ben Sass resigned at the University of Florida, Kent Fox, who was the old University of Florida president, came back in an interim role. Kent Fox 7 years ago was the one that hired Scott Strickland. Kent Fox has a lot of other things that he's working on right now at the University of Florida that kind of were forgotten about when Ben Sass was president. So I think Kent Fox is really focusing on a lot of those things. And I think beyond all of the things that he's trying to do at the University of Florida, I don't think making a change at the athletic director position was on the top of that list. And I think that the next university president will evaluate and determine whether Scott Strickland is the right person to have in this role moving forward. But I don't think that if Billy Napier was let go at the University of Florida, that Scott Strickland would have that decision of who the next head coach would be. And I think this might be Scott trying to save face for a little while, but also, firing an athletic director creates a lot of internal, turmoil as well. And maybe if the university decides, Scott Strickland, it's your time to go, you bring in a new athletic director who will then potentially go in and hire a new head football coach. And that's certainly a very different situation than firing Billy Napier, hiring a new head coach, and then letting your athletic director go, which is what a lot of the fan base wants as well. And not just him, but kind of the leadership of the athletic department.
Yeah. Dan, where can people follow you? Where can they get more of your work and content?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on, TJ. You can follow me on X. It's DK Thompson. Or you can follow my podcast, Stadium and Gale. That's Gale. So Stadium and Gale. We're on YouTube and all the podcast platforms. And certainly, TJ, appreciate you having me on. And you'd be welcome to come back anytime.
Thanks, buddy.